Chapter 6. Dr. Trent was gruff and as abrupt as usual, but he did not tell her her ailment was imaginary. After he listened to her symptoms and asked a few questions and made a quick examination, he sat for a moment looking at her quite intently. Valancy thought he looked at her as if he were sorry for her. She caught her breath for a moment. Was the trouble serious? Oh, it couldn't be, surely. It really hadn't bothered her much. Only lately it had gotten a little worse. Dr. Trent opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the telephone at his elbow rang sharply. He picked up the receiver. Valancy, watching him, saw his face change suddenly as he listened. "Oh, yes, what? Yes." A brief interval. "My God!" Dr. Trent dropped the receiver and dashed out of the room and upstairs without even a glance at Valancy. She heard him rushing madly about overhead, barking out a few remarks to somebody, presumably his housekeeper. Then he came tearing downstairs with a club bag in his hand, snatched his hat and coat off from the rack, and jerked the door open and rushed down the street in the direction of the station. Valancy sat alone in the little office, feeling more absolutely foolish than she'd ever felt in her life. Foolish and humiliated. So this was what had come from her heroic determination to live up to John Foster and cast fear aside. Not only was she a failure as a relative and non-existent as a sweetheart or friend, but she had not even of any importance as a patient. Dr. Trent had forgotten her very presence in his excitement over whatever message had come by telephone. She gained nothing by ignoring Uncle James and flying in the face of family tradition. For a moment she was afraid she was going to cry. It was all so ridiculous. Then she heard Dr. Trent's housekeeper come down the stairs. Valancy rose and went to the office door. "The doctor forgot all about me," she said with a twisted smile. "Well, it's too bad," said Mrs. Patterson sympathetically. "But it isn't much a wonder, poor man. That was the telegraph they phoned over from the port. His son has been terribly injured in an auto accident in Montreal. The doctor had just 10 minutes to catch the train, and I don't know what they'd do if anything happens to Ned. He's just so bound up in the boy. You'll have to come again, Miss Sterling. I hope it's nothing serious." "Oh, no, nothing serious," agreed Valancy. She felt a little less humiliated. It was no wonder poor Dr. Trent had forgotten her at such a moment. Nevertheless, she felt very flat and discouraged as she went down the street. Valancy went home by the shortcut of Lover's Lane. She did not go often through Lover's Lane, but it was getting near supper time, and it would never do to be late. Lover's Lane wound at the back of the village, under great elms and maples, and deserved its name. It was hard to go there at any time and not find some canoodling couple, or young girls in pairs, arms entwined, talking earnestly over their secrets. Valancy didn't know which made her feel more self-conscious or uncomfortable. This evening she encountered both. She met Connie Hale and Kate Bailey, in new pink organdy dresses with flowers stuck coquettishly in their glossy bare hair. Valancy had never had a pink dress or worn flowers in her hair. Then she passed a young couple she didn't know, dawdling along, oblivious to everything but themselves. The young man's arm was around the girl's waist quite shamelessly. Valancy had never walked with a man's arm about her. She felt she ought to be shocked. They might leave that sort of things for screening twilight at least. But she wasn't shocked. In another flash of desperate, stark honesty, she owed to herself that she was merely envious. When she passed them, she felt quite sure they were laughing at her, pitying her. "There's that queer old little maid, Valancy Sterling. They say she never had a beau in her whole life." Valancy fairly ran to get out of Lover's Lane. Never had she felt so utterly colorless and skinny and insignificant. Just where Lover's Lane debouched on the street, an old car was parked. Valancy knew that car well, by sound at least, and everybody in Deerwood knew it. It was before the phrase "Tin Lizzie" had come into circulation, in Deerwood at least, but if it had been known, this car was the tinniest of Lizzies, though it was not a Ford, but an old grey Solson. Nothing more battered or disreputable could be imagined. It was Barney Snite's car, and Barney himself was just scrambling up from underneath it in overalls plastered with mud. Valancy gave him a swift, furtive look as she hurried by. This was only the second time she had seen the notorious Barney Snipe, though she had heard enough about him in 5 years that he'd been living "back up" in Muskoka. The first time had been nearly a year ago, on the Muskoka road. He'd been crawling out from under his car then, too, and given her a cheerful grin as she went by, a little, whimsical grin that gave him the look of an amused gnome. He didn't look bad. She didn't believe he was bad, in spite of the wild yarns that were always being told of him. Of course, he went tearing in that terrible old gray Slolson through Deerwood at hours when all decent people were in bed, often with old Roaring Abel, who made the night hideous with howls. "Both of them dead drunk, my dear!" And everyone knew he was an escaped convict, and a defaulting bank clerk, and a murderer in hiding, and an infidel, and an illegitimate son of Roaring Abel Gay, and the father of Roaring Abel Gay's illegitimate granddaughter, and a counterfeiter, and a forger, and a few other awful bad things. But still, Valancy didn't believe he was bad. Nobody with a smile like that could be bad, no matter what he had done. It was just that night the Prince of Blue Castle changed from being a grim jaw and hair with a dash of premature gray to a rakish individual with overly long tawny hair dashed with red, dark brown eyes and ears that stuck out just enough to give him an alert look, but not enough to be called flying jibs. But he still retained something a little bit grim about the jaw. Barney Snipe looked even more disreputable than usual just now. It was very evident that he hadn't shaved for days, and his hands and arms, bare at the shoulders, were black with grease. But he was whistling gleefully to himself, and he seemed so happy that Valancy envied him. She envied him his light-heartedness and his irresponsibility, and his mysterious little cabin up on the island in the Lake Mistawas, even his rackety old gray Slolson. Neither he nor his car had to be respectable and live up to traditions. When he rattled past her a few minutes later, bareheaded, leaning back in his Lizzie at the rakish angle, his longish hair blowing in the wind, a villainous-looking old black pipe in his mouth, she envied him again. Men had the best of it, no doubt about it. This outlaw was happy, whatever he was or wasn't. She, Valancy Sterling, respectable, well-behaved to the last degree, was unhappy, and always been unhappy. So, there you were. Valancy was just in time for supper. The sun had clouded over, and a dismal, drizzling rain was falling again. Cousin Stickles had the neuralgia. Valancy had to do the family darning, and there was no time for the magic of wings. "Can't the darning wait until tomorrow?" she pleaded. "Tomorrow will bring its own duties," said Mrs. Frederick inexplorably. Valancy darned all the evening, and listened to Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles talk about the eternal, niggling gossip of the clan, as they knitted drearily at interminable black stockings. They discussed second cousin Lillian's approaching wedding in all its bearings. On the whole, they approved. Second cousin Lillian was doing well for herself. "Although she hasn't hurried," said Cousin Stickle, "she must be 25. There have not, fortunately, been many old maids in our connection," said Mrs. Frederick bitterly. Valancy flinched. She'd run the darning needle into her finger. Third cousin Aaron Gray had been scratched by a cat and had blood poisoning in his finger. "Cats are a most dangerous animal," said Mrs. Frederick. "I would never have a cat about the house." She glared significantly at Valancy through her terrible glasses. Once, 5 years ago, Valancy had asked if they might have a cat. She had never referred to it since, but Mrs. Frederick had suspected her of harboring unlawful desire in her heart of hearts. Once Valancy sneezed. Now, in the Sterling Code, it was very bad form to sneeze in public. "You can always repress a sneeze by pressing your finger on your upper lip," said Mrs. Frederick rebukingly. 9:30 or so, as Mr. Pepys would say, to bed. But first cousin Stickles' neuralgic back must be rubbed with Redfern's liniment. Valancy did that. Valancy always had to do that. She hated the smell of Redfern's liniment. She hated the smug, beaming, portly, be-whiskered, be-speckled picture of Dr. Redfern on the bottle. Her fingers smelled of the horrible stuff after she got into bed, in spite of all the scrubbing she had gave them. Valancy's day of destiny had come and gone. She ended it as it begun, in tears. Chapter 7. There was a rose bush in the little Sterling lawn growing beside the gate. It was called Doss's rose bush. Cousin Georgiana had given it to Valancy 5 years ago, and Valancy had planted it joyfully. She loved roses, but, of course, the rose bush never bloomed. That was her luck. Valancy did everything she could think of, and took the advice of everybody in the clan, but still the rose bush would not bloom. It throve and grew luxuriantly, with great leafy branches untouched by rust or spider, but not even a bud had ever appeared. Valancy, looking at it 2 days after her birthday, was filled with sudden, overwhelming hatred for it. The thing wouldn't bloom. Very well, then, she would cut it down. She marched to the tool room in the barn for her garden knife, and she went at the rose bush viciously. A few minutes later, horrified Mrs. Frederick came out to the veranda and beheld her daughter slashing insanely among the rose boughs. Half of them were already strewn on the sidewalk. The bush looked sadly dismantled. "Doss, what on earth are you doing? Have you gone crazy?" "No," said Valancy. She meant to say it defiantly, but the habit was too strong for her. She said it deprecatingly. I just made my mind up to cut this bush down. It's no good. It never blooms, never will bloom." "That's no reason for destroying it," said Mrs. Frederick sternly. "It was a beautiful bush and quite ornamental. You've made a sorry-looking thing of it." "Rose trees should bloom," said Valancy a little obstinately. "Don't argue with me, Doss. Clear up that mess and leave that bush alone. I don't know what Georgiana will say when she sees how you've hacked it to pieces. Really, I'm surprised at you. And you do it without consulting me." "The bush is mine," muttered Valancy. "What's that? What did you say, Doss?" "I only said the bush was mine," repeated Valancy humbly. Mrs. Frederick turned without a word and marched back into the house. The mischief was done now. Valancy knew she had offended her mother deeply, and would not be spoken to or noticed in any way for 2 or 3 days. Cousin Sickles would see to Valancy's bringing up, but Mrs. Frederick would preserve the stony silence out of outraged majesty. Valancy sighed and put away her garden knife, hanging it precisely on its precise nail in the tool shop. She cleared away several branches and swept up the leaves. Her lips twitched as she looked at the strangling bush. It had an odd resemblance to its shaken, scrawny donor, little cousin Georgiana herself. "I certainly have made an awful-looking thing of it," thought Valancy, but she did not feel repentant, only sorry she had offended her mother. Things would be so uncomfortable until she was forgiven. Mrs. Frederick was one of those women who can make her anger felt all over the house. Walls and doors were no protection from it. "You better go uptown and get the mail," said Cousin Stickles when Valancy went in. "I can't go get it. I feel all peaky and pinny this spring. I want you to stop at the drugstore and give me a bottle of Redfern's blood bitters. There's nothing like Redfern's bitters for building the body up. Cousin James says purple pills are the best, but I know better. My dear poor husband took Redfern's bitters right up until the day he died. Don't let them charge you more than 90 cents. I can get that for the port. And what have you been saying to your poor mother? Do you ever stop to think, Doss, that you can only have one mother?" "One is enough for me," thought Valancy undutifully as she went uptown. She got Cousin Stickles bottles of bitters, and then she went to the post office and asked for her mail at the general delivery. Her mother did not have a box. They got too little mail to bother with it. Valancy did not expect any mail, except for the Christian Times, which was the only paper they took. They hardly ever got any letters, but Valancy rather liked to stand in the office and watch Mr. Carraway, the gray-bearded, Santa Clausy old clerk, handing out letters to the lucky people that did get them. He did it with such detached, impersonal, Jove-like air, as if it did not matter in the least to him what supernal joys or shattering horrors might be in those letters for the people to whom they were addressed. Letters had a fascination for Valancy, perhaps because she so seldom got any. In her blue castle exciting epistles, bound with silk and sealed with crimson, they were always being brought to her by pages in liveries of gold and blue. But in her real life, her only letters were occasional perfunctory notes from relatives, or an advertising circular. Consequently, she was immensely surprised when Mr. Carraway, looking even more jovial than usual, poked a letter out to her. Yes, it was addressed to her plainly, in fierce black handwriting. Miss Valancy Sterling, Elm Street, Deerwood. And the postmark was Montreal. Valancy picked it up with a little quickening in her breath. Montreal? It must be from Dr. Trent. He'd remembered her after all. Valancy met Uncle Benjamin coming in as she was going out, and was glad the letter was safely in her bag.
"What," said Uncle Benjamin, "is the difference between a donkey and a postage stamp?"
I don't know. What? Valancy answered dutifully.
"One you lick with a stick, and the other you lick with a lick. Ha ha ha!"
Uncle Benjamin passed in, tremendously pleased with himself. Cousin Stickles pounced on the Times when Valancy got home, but did not occur to ask if there were any letters. Mrs. Frederick would have asked, but Mrs. Frederick's lips at the present were sealed. Valancy was glad of this. If her mother had asked her if there were any letters, Valancy might have admitted there were, and then she would have had to let her mother and Cousin Stickles read the letter, and all would be discovered. Her heart acted strangely on the way upstairs, and she sat down by her window for a few minutes before opening her letter. She felt very guilty and deceitful. She had never before kept a letter secret from her mother. Every letter she had ever written or received had been read by Mrs. Frederick. That had never mattered. Valancy had never had anything to hide. But this did matter. She could not have had anyone see this letter. But her fingers trembled with consciousness of wickedness and unfilial conduct as she opened it, trembled a little too, perhaps, with apprehension. She felt quite sure there was nothing seriously wrong with her heart, but one never knew. Dr. Trent's letters was like himself, blunt, abrupt, concise, no wasting words. Dr. Trent never beat about the bush. Dear Mrs. Sterling, and then a page of black, positive writing. Valancy seemed to read it at a glance. She dropped it on her lap, her face ghost white. Dr. Trent had told her she had a very dangerous and fatal form of heart disease, angina pectoris, evidently complicated with an aneurysm, whatever that was, and in the last stages. He said, without mincing matters, that nothing could be done for her. If she took great care of herself, she might live a year, but she also might die at any moment. Dr. Trent never troubled himself about euphemisms. She must be careful to avoid all excitement and all severe muscular efforts. She must eat and drink moderately. She must never run. She must go upstairs and hill with great care. Any sudden jolt or shock might be fatal. She was to get a prescription of her enclosed filled and carry it with her always, taking a dose whenever she felt her attacks come on. And he was her truly, H. B. Trent. Valancy sat for a long while by her window. Outside was a world drowned in the light of the spring afternoon, skies entrancingly blue, winds perfumed and free, lovely, soft, blue hazes at the end of every street. Over at the railway station, a group of young girls was waiting for the train. She heard their gay laughter as they chattered and joked. The train roared in and roared out again, but none of these things had any reality. Nothing had reality except for the fact that she only had another year to live. When she was tired of sitting at the window, she went over and lay down on her bed, staring at the cracked, discolored ceiling. A curious numbness had followed on the staggering blow, possessed her. She did not feel anything, except a boundless surprise and incredulity, behind which was the conviction that Dr. Trent knew his business and that she, Valancy Sterling, who had never lived, was about to die. When the gong rang for supper, Valancy got up and went downstairs mechanically from force of habit. She had wondered that she had been left alone so long, but of course her mother had not paid any attention to her just now. Valancy was thankful for this. She thought that the quarrel over the rose bush had been really, as Mrs. Frederick might have said herself, providential. She could not eat anything, but both Miss Frederick and Cousin Stickles thought this was because she was deservedly unhappy over her mother's attitude, and her lack of appetite was not commented on. Valancy forced herself to swallow a cup of tea, and then sat and watched the others eat, with an odd feeling that years had passed since she had sat in with them at the dinner table. She found herself smiling inwardly to think what a commotion she would make if she chose. Let her merely tell them what was in Dr. Trent's letter, and there would be as much fuss made as if, Valancy thought bitterly, They really cared for 2 straws about her.
Dr. Trent's housekeeper's got a word from him today, said Cousin Stickles, so suddenly that Valancy jumped guiltily.
Was there anything in thought waves?
Mrs. Judd was talking about it uptown. I think his son is going to recover, but Dr. Trent wrote that if he did, he was going to take him abroad as soon as he was able to travel, and he wouldn't be back here for at least a year. That will not matter much to us, said Mrs. Frederick majestically. He is not our doctor, and I would not.
Here she looked over, and seemed to look accusingly right through Valancy.
Have him doctor a sick cat.
May I go upstairs and lie down? Said Valancy faintly. I have a headache.
What has given you a headache? What has given you a headache? Asked Cousin Stickles, since Mrs. Frederick could not. The question had to be asked. Valancy would not be allowed to have headaches without interference. You ain't in the habits of having headaches. I hope you're not taking the mumps. Here, try a spoonful of vinegar. Piffle, Valancy said rudely, getting up from the table. She did not care just then if she was rude. She had to be so polite all her life. If it had been possible for Cousin Stickles to turn pale, she would have. As it was not, she turned yellower. Have you gone feverish, Doss? You sound like it. You go and get right into bed, said Cousin Stickles, thoroughly alarmed. I'll come up and rub your forehead and back of your neck with Redfern's liniment. Valancy had reached the door when she turned. I won't be rubbed with Redfern's liniment, she said. Cousin Stickles stared and gasped. What? What do you mean? I said I wouldn't be rubbed with Redfern's liniment, repeated Valancy. Horrid, sticky stuff, and it has the vilest smell of any liniment I ever saw. It's no good. I want to be left alone, that's all. Valancy went out, leaving Cousin Stickles aghast. She's feverish. She must be feverish, ejaculated Cousin Stickles. Mrs. Frederick went on eating her supper. It did not matter whether Valancy was or was not feverish. Valancy had been guilty of impertinence to her. Chapter 8. Valancy did not sleep that night. She lay awake all through the long, dark hours, thinking. She had made a discovery that almost surprised her. She, who had been afraid of almost anything in life, was not afraid of death. It did not seem the least terrible to her, and she need not now be afraid of anything else. Why had she been afraid of things? Because of life. Afraid Uncle Benjamin because of the menace of poverty and old age. But now she would never be old, neglected, tolerated. Afraid of being old maid her whole life? Well, now she would not be an old maid very long. Afraid of offending her mother and then her clan because she had to live with them and among them, and couldn't live peaceably if she didn't give in to them. But now she hadn't. Valancy felt a curious freedom. But she still was horribly afraid of one thing. The fuss the whole jamfrey would make when she told them. Valancy shuddered at the thought of it. She couldn't endure it. Oh, she knew well how it would be. First, there would be indignation. Yes, indignation on the part of Uncle James because she had gone to a doctor, any doctor, without consulting him. Indignation on the part of her mother for being so sly and deceitful. To your own mother, Doss. Indignation on the part of the whole clan because she had not gone to Dr. Marsh. Then would come the solicitude. She would be taken to Dr. Marsh, and then Dr. Marsh would confirm Dr. Trent's diagnosis. She would be taken to specialists in Toronto and Montreal. Uncle Benjamin would foot the bill with a splendid gesture of magnificence in thus assisting the orphan and widow, and talk forever about the shocking fees specialists charged for looking wise and saying they couldn't do anything. And when the specialist could do nothing for her, Uncle James would insist on her taking purple pills. I've known them to cure when all doctors given up. And her mother would insist on Redfern's blood bitters, and Cousin Stickles would insist on rubbing her over her heart every night with Redfern's liniment on the grounds that it might do some good and it couldn't do harm, and everybody else would have some pet dope for her to take. Dr. Stalling would come to her and say solemnly, You are very ill. Are you prepared for what may be before you? Almost as if he was going to shake his forefinger at her, a forefinger that had not grown any shorter or less knobbly with age, and she would be watched and checked like a baby, and would never be allowed to do anything or go anywhere alone. Perhaps she would not even be allowed to sleep alone, lest she would die in her sleep. Cousin Stickles or her mother would insist on sharing her room and her bed, and yes, undoubtedly they would. This was the last thought that really decided Valancy. She could not put up with it, and she wouldn't. As the clock in the hall below struck 12, Valancy suddenly and finally made up her mind that she would not tell anybody. She had always been told, ever since she could remember, that she must hide her feelings. "It's not ladylike to have feelings," Cousin Stickle had once told her disapprovingly. Well, she could hide them with a vengeance. But though she was afraid of death, she was not indifferent to it. She found she resented it. It was not fair that she would have died when she had never lived. Rebellion flamed up in her soul as the dark hours passed by, not because she had no future, but because she had no past. "I'm poor, I'm ugly, I'm a failure, and I'm near death," she thought. She could see her own obituary notice in the Deerwood Weekly Times, copied into the Port Lawrence Journal. "A deep gloom was cast over Deerwood, etc., etc. Leaves a large circle of friends to mourn, etc., etc., etc." Lies! All lies! Gloom, forsooth! No one would miss her. Her death would not even matter a straw to anybody. Not even her mother loved her. Her mother, who had been so disappointed that she had not been a boy, or at least a pretty girl. Valancy reviewed her whole life between midnight and early spring dawn. It was a very drab existence, but here and there an incident loomed with significance out of all proportion to its real importance. These incidents were all unpleasant in one way or another. Nothing really pleasant had ever happened to Valancy. "I've never had one wholly happy hour in my life. Not one," she thought. "I've just been a colorless non-entity. I remember reading somewhere once that there was an hour in which a woman might be happy in her life if she could but find it. I've never found my hour. Never, never. And I never will now. If I could only have had that hour, I'd be willing to die." Those significant incidences kept bobbing up in her mind like unbidden ghosts, without any sequence of time or place. For instance, that time at 16, when she had blued a tub full of clothes too deeply, and that time when, at 8, she had stolen some raspberry jam from Aunt Wellington's party. Valancy had never heard the last of these two misdemeanors. At almost every clan gathering they were raked up against her as jokes. Uncle Benjamin hardly ever missed retelling her raspberry jam incident. He had been the one to catch her, her face all stained and streaked. "I really have done so few bad things that they really keep harping on the old ones," thought Valancy. "Why, I've never even had a quarrel with anyone. I've never had an enemy. What a spineless thing I must be not to even have one enemy." There was that incident of the dust pile at school when she was 7. Valancy always recalled when Dr. Sterling referred to the text. "To him that hath shall been given, and from him that shall not be taken, even that which he hath." Other people might puzzle over that text, but it never puzzled Valancy. The whole relationship between herself and Olive, dating from the day of the dust pile, was a commentary on it. She had been going to school a year, but Olive, who was a year younger, had just begun, and had about her all the glamour of a new girl, an exceedingly pretty girl at that. It was recess, and all the girls, big and little, were out on the road in front of the school making dust piles. The aim of each girl was to have the biggest pile. Valancy was good at making dust piles. There was an art to it, and she had secret hopes of leading. But Olive, working off by herself, had suddenly discovered to have a larger dust pile than everybody. Valancy felt no jealousy. Her dust pile was quite big enough to please her. Then one of the older girls had inspiration. "Let's put all of our dust on Olive's pile and make a tremendous one," she exclaimed. A frenzy seemed to seize the girls. They swooped down on the dust piles with pails and shovels. In a few seconds Olive's pile was a veritable pyramid. In vain Valancy, with scrawny outstretched little arms, tried to protect hers. She was ruthlessly swept aside, her dust pile scooped and poured into Olive's. Valancy turned away, resolutely, and began building another dust pile.
Again, a bigger girl pounced on it. Valancy stood before it, flushed, indignant, arms outstretched. "Don't take it," she pleaded. "Please don't take it." "But why?" demanded the older girl. "Why won't you help build Olive's bigger?" "I want my own little dust pile," said Valancy piteously. Her plea went unheeded. While she argued with one girl, another scraped up her dust pile. Valancy turned away, her heart swelling, her eyes full of tears. "Jealous! You're jealous!" said the girls mockingly. "You were very selfish," said her mother coldly when Valancy told her about it that night. That was the first and last time Valancy had ever taken any of her troubles to her mother. Valancy was neither jealous nor selfish. It was only that she wanted a dust pile of her own. Small or big mattered not. A team of horses came down the road. Olive's dust pile was scattered over the roadway. The bell rang. The girls trooped into school and had forgotten the whole affair before they reached their seats. Valancy never forgot it. To this day she resented it in her secret soul. But was it not symbolic of her life? "I've never been able to have my own dust pile," thought Valancy. The enormous red moon she had seen rising right at the end of the street one autumn evening of her 6th year. She had been sick and cold with the awful uncanny horror of it. So near to her. So big. She had run in trembling to her mother, and her mother had laughed at her. She had gone to bed and hid her face under the clothes in terror, lest she look out the window and see that horrible moon glaring through her. The boy who had tried to kiss her at a party when she was 15, she had not laid him. She had evaded him and run. He was the only boy who had ever tried to kiss her. Now, 14 years later, Valancy found herself wishing she had let him. The one time she had been made to apologize for Olive. The one time she had been made to apologize to Olive for something she hadn't done. Olive had said Valancy had pushed her into mud and spoiled her new shoes on purpose. Valancy knew she hadn't. It had been an accident, and even that wasn't her fault. But nobody would believe her. She had to apologize and kiss Olive to make up. The injustice of it burned in her soul tonight. The summer when Olive had the most beautiful hat trimmed with creamy yellow net, and a wreath of red roses and a little ribbon bows under the chin. Valancy had wanted that hat more than she'd wanted anything. She pleaded for it and had been laughed at. All summer she had to wear a horrid little brown sailor with elastics that cut behind her ears. None of the other girls would go around her because she was so shabby. Nobody but Olive. People had thought Olive was so sweet and unselfish. I was an excellent foil for her, thought Valancy. Even then she knew that. Valancy had tried to win a prize for attendance in Sunday school once, but Olive had won it. There were so many Sundays Valancy had to stay home because she had colds. She had once tried to say a piece in school one Friday afternoon and had broken down in it. Olive was a good reciter and never got stuck. That night she spent in Port Lawrence with Aunt Isabel when she was 10. Byron Sterling was there, from Montreal. 12 years old, conceited, clever. At family prayers in the morning, Byron had reached across and given Valancy's thin arm such a savage pinch she screamed out in pain. After prayers were over, she was summoned to Aunt Isabel's bar of judgment. But when she said Byron had pinched her, Byron denied it. He said she cried out because the kitten scratched her. She said she put the kitten up on her chair and was playing with it, when she should have been listening to Uncle David's prayer. He was believed. In the Sterling clan, the boys were always believed before the girls. Valancy was sent home in disgrace because of her exceedingly bad behavior during family prayers, and she was not asked to Aunt Isabel's again for many moons. The time cousin Betty Sterling was married. Somehow, Valancy got wind of the fact that Betty was going to ask her to be one of her bridesmaids. Valancy was secretly uplifted. It would be a delightful thing to be a bridesmaid, and of course she would have to have a new dress for it. A pretty new dress, a pink dress. Betty wanted her bridesmaids to be dressed in pink. But Betty had never asked her after all. Valancy couldn't guess why, but long after her secret tears of disappointment had been dried, Olive told her. Betty, after much consultation and reflection, had decided that Valancy was too insignificant. She would spoil the effect. That was 9 years ago, but tonight Valancy caught her breath with old pain and the sting of it. That day, on her 11th year, when her mother had badgered her into confessing something she had never done, Valencia denied it for a long time, but eventually, for Pete's sakes, she'd given in and pleaded guilty. Mrs. Frederick was always making people lie by pushing them into situations where they had to lie. Then her mother made her kneel down on the parlor floor between herself and Cousin Sickles and say, "Oh, God, please forgive me for not speaking the truth." Valencia had said it, but as she rose from her feet she muttered, "But, oh God, you know I speak the truth." Valencia had not then heard of Galileo, but her fate was similar to his. She was punished just as severely as if she hadn't confessed and prayed. The winter she went to dancing school. Uncle James had declared she should go, and pay for her lessons. How she looked forward to it, and how she hated it! She never had a voluntary partner. The teacher always had to tell some boy to dance with her, and generally he had been sulky about it. Yet Valancy was a good dancer, as light on her feet as thistledowns. Olive, who never lacked eager partners, was heavy. The affair of the button strings when she was 10. All the girls in school had button strings. Olive had a very long one with a great many beautiful buttons. Valancy had one. Most of the buttons on it were very commonplace, but she had 6 beauties that had come off Grandmother Sterling's wedding gown, sparkling buttons of gold and glass, much more beautiful than any Olive had. Their possession had conferred a certain distinction on Valancy. She knew every little girl in school envied her those exclusive possessions of those beautiful buttons. When Olive saw them on the button strings, she had looked at them narrowly, but said nothing. Then, the next day, Aunt Wellington came to Elm Street and told Mrs. Frederick that she thought Olive would have some of the buttons. Grandma Sterling was just as much a Wellington's mother as Frederick's. Mrs. Frederick had agreed amiably. She could not afford a fallout with Aunt Wellington. Moreover, the matter was of no importance whatsoever. Aunt Wellington carried off 4 of the buttons, generously leaving 2 for Valancy. Valancy had torn these from her string and flung them on the floor. She had not yet learned it was unladylike to have feelings, and had been sent supperless to bed for the exhibition. The night of Margaret Blunt's party, she had made such pathetic efforts to be pretty that night. Robert Walker was to be there, and 2 nights before, on the moonlit veranda of Uncle Herbert's cottage in Mistawas, Robert had really seemed attracted to her. At Margaret's party, Robert had never even asked her to dance, did not notice her at all. She was a wallflower, as usual. That, of course, was years ago. People in Deerwood had long given up inviting Valancy to dances, but to Valancy its humiliation and disappointment were of the other day. Her face burned in the darkness as she recalled herself sitting there in her pitiful, crimped, thin hair, and the cheeks she had pinched for an hour before coming in an effort to make them red. All that came of it was a wild story that Valancy Sterling was rouged at Margaret Blunt's party. In those days in Deerwood, it was enough to wreck your character forever. It did not wreck Valancy's, or even damage it. People knew she couldn't be fast if she tried. They only laughed at her. "I've had nothing but a second-hand existence," decided Valancy. "All the great emotions of a life have passed me by. I've never even had grief. And have I ever really loved anybody? Do I really love Mother? No, I don't. That's the truth. Whether it's disgraceful or not, I don't love her. I've never loved her. What's worse, I don't even like her. So I don't know anything about any kind of love. My life has been empty. Empty. Nothing worse than emptiness. Nothing!" Valancy ejaculated the last word, "nothing," aloud, passionately. Then she moaned and stopped thinking about anything for a while. One of her attacks of pain had come on. When it was over, something happened to Valancy. Perhaps it was a culmination of the process that had been going on in her mind ever since she read Dr. Trent's letter. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, the wisest and most accursed hour of the clock. But sometimes it sets us free. "I've been trying to please other people all my life, and failed," she said. "After this I shall please myself. I shall never pretend anything again. I've breathed an atmosphere of fibs and pretenses and evasions all my life. What a luxury it will be to tell the truth! I may not be able to do much that I want to do, but I won't do another thing that I don't want to do. Mother can pout over it for weeks. I shan't worry over it. Despair is a free man. Hope is a slave." Valancy got up and dressed, and with the deepening of that curious sense of freedom. When she finished with her hair, she opened the window, hurled out a jar of potpourri over the next lot. It smashed gloriously against the schoolgirl complexion on the old carriage shop. "I'm sick of the fragrance of dead things," said Valancy. Chapter 9. Uncle Herbert and Aunt Alberta's silver wedding was delicately referred to among the Sterlings during the following weeks as "the time we first noticed Valancy was a little, you understand." Not for words would any of the Sterlings have said out and out at first what Valancy had gone mildly insane, or even that her mind was slightly deranged. Uncle Benjamin had considered to have gone entirely too far when he ejaculated, "She's dippy, I tell you! She's dippy!" and was only excused because of the outrageousness of Valancy's conduct at the aforesaid wedding dinner. But Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Sterling had noticed a few things that made them easy before the dinner. It had begun with the rosebush, of course, and Valancy never was really quite right again. She did not seem to worry in the least over the fact her mother was not speaking to her. You would never suppose she noticed it at all. She devoutly refused to take either Purple Bills or Redfern's bitters. She would announce coolly that she did not intend to answer to the name Doss any longer. She had told Cousin Stickles that she'd wished she would give up wearing the brooch with Cousin Artemis Stickles' hair in it. She had moved her bed in her room to the opposite corner. She had read Magic of Wings Sunday afternoon. When Cousin Stickles had rebuked her, Valancy had said indifferently, "Oh, I forgot it was Sunday," and then had gone on reading. Cousin Stickles had seen a terrible thing. She had caught Valancy sliding down the banister. Cousin Stickles did not tell Mrs. Frederick about it. Poor Amelia was worried enough as it was. But it was Valancy's announcement on Sunday night that she was not going to go to the Anglican church any more that broke through Mrs. Frederick's stony silence. "Not going to church any more? Doss, have you absolutely taken your leave?" "Oh, I'm going to church," said Valancy airily. "I'm going to the Presbyterian church, but to the Anglican church I will not go." This was even worse. Mrs. Frederick had recourse to tears, having found outraged majesty had ceased to be effective. "What have you got against the Anglican church?" she sobbed. "Nothing, only you've always made me go there. If you had made me go to the Presbyterian church, I'd want to go to the Anglican." "Is that a nice thing to say to your mother? Oh, how true it is, it's sharper than a serpent's tongue to have a thankless child." "Is that a nice thing to say to your daughter?" said unrepentant Valancy. So Valancy's behavior at the Will Silver wedding was not quite the surprise to Mrs. Frederick and Christine Stickles as it was to the rest. They were doubtful about the wisdom of taking her, but concluded it would make talk if they didn't. Perhaps she would behave herself, and so far no outsider had suspected there was anything queer about her. By special mercy of Providence, it had poured torrents Sunday morning, so Valancy had not carried out her hideous threat of going to the Presbyterian church. Valancy would not have cared in the least if they had left her at home. These family celebrations were all hopelessly dull, but the Sterling family always celebrated everything. It was a long-established custom. Even Mrs. Frederick gave a dinner party on her wedding anniversary, and Cousin Stickles had friends in to supper on her birthday. Valancy hated these entertainments because they had to pinch and save and contrive for weeks afterwards to pay for them. But she wanted to go to the Silver wedding. It would hurt Uncle Herbert's feelings if she stayed away, and she rather liked Uncle Herbert. Besides, she wanted to look over her relatives from her new angle. It would be an excellent place to make public her declaration of independence if occasion offered. "Put on your brown silk dress," said Mrs. Sterling. As if there was anything else to put on! Valancy had only one festive dress, that stuffy brown silk Aunt Isabel had given her. Aunt Isabel decreed that Valancy should never wear colors. They did not become her. When she had been young she had been allowed to wear white, but that had been tacitly dropped for some years. Valancy put on this brown silk. It had a high collar and long sleeves. She had never had a dress with a low neck or elbow sleeves, though they had been worn, even in Deerwood, for over a year. But she did not do her hair in a pompadour. She knotted it at her neck and pulled it out over her ears. She thought it became her. Only the little knot was so absurdly small. Mrs. Frederick resented the hair, but decided it was wisest to say nothing on the eve of the party. It was so important that Valancy should be kept in good humor, if possible, until it was over. Mrs. Frederick did not reflect that this was the first time in her life that she had thought it was necessary to consider Vallancey's humours, but then Vallancey had never been queer before. On their way to Cousin Herbert's, Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles walking in front, Vallancey meekly trotting behind them. Roaring Abel drove past, drunk as usual, but not in the roaring stage, just drunk enough to be excessively polite. He raised his disreputable old tartan cap with the air of a monarch saluting his subjects, and swept them a grand bow. Mrs. Frederick and Cousin Stickles dared not cut Roaring Abel altogether. He was the only person in Deerwood who could be got to do the odd jobs of carpeting and repairing when they needed to be done, so it would not do to offend him. But they responded only with the stiffest, slightest bows. Roaring Abel must be kept in his place. Vallancey, behind them, did a thing they were fortunately spared seeing. She smiled gaily and waved her hand to Roaring Abel. Why not? She had always liked the old sinner. He was jolly, picturesque, unashamedly reprobate, and stood out against the drab respectability of Deerwood and its customs like a flame-red rag of revolt and protest. Only a few nights ago Abel had gone through Deerwood in the wee smalls, shouting oaths at the top of his stentorian voice, which could be heard for miles, and lashing his horse into a furious gallop as he tore along prim Popper Elm Street, yelling and blaspheming like a fiend, shuddered Cousin Stickles at the breakfast table. I cannot understand why the judgment of the Lord has not fallen upon that man ere this, said Mrs. Frederick petulantly, as if she thought Providence was very dilatory and ought to have a gentle reminder. He'll be picked up dead some morning. He'll fall under his horse's hoofs and be trampled to death, said Cousin Stickles reassuringly. Vallancey had said nothing, of course, but she wondered to herself if Roaring Abel's periodic sprees were not his futile protest against the poverty and drudgery and monotony of his existence. She went on dream sprees in her blue castle. Roaring Abel, having no imagination, could not do that. His escape from reality had to be concrete. So she waved at him today with a sudden fellow feeling, and Roaring Abel, not too drunk to be astonished, nearly fell off his seat in amazement. By the time they had reached Maple Avenue and Uncle Herbert's house, a large, pretentious structure peppered with meaningless bay windows and excrescent porches, a house that always looked like a stupid, ponderous, self-satisfied man with warts on his face. A house like that, said Vallancey solemnly, is a blasphemy. Mrs. Frederick was shaken to her soul. What had Vallancey said? Was it profane, or was it only just queer? Mrs. Frederick took off her hat in Aunt Alberta's spare room with trembling hands. She made one more feeble attempt to avert disaster. She held Vallancey back on the landing as Cousin Stickles went downstairs. Won't you try to remember you're a lady? She pleaded. Oh, if there was only any hope of being able to forget it, said Vallancey wearily. Mrs. Frederick felt she had not deserved this from Providence.